Blessings. Welcome to today's Law Enforcement Daily Devotional. Today we're in 1 Corinthians chapters 5 through 8. Yesterday we had just kind of a time of summarization of what Paul's talking about in Corinthians. And today we're going to talk about some of the freedoms and acting humble in those freedoms. So, and I'm not going to get really deep into it, kind of like yesterday. I didn't get really deep. I mean, there's just so much in Corinthians. This is one of those books that really teaches. This one preaches. First and Second Thessalonians, man, was just a book of encouragement. But to me, it wasn't one of those that steps on my toes and says, "Hey, this is where you're messing up." Corinthians can be that way, depending, on lifestyles and where you are in your spiritual maturity, as we talked about yesterday. But chapter 5, verse 1, Paul, he changes from what we were talking about yesterday. He switches gears into this. All of a sudden, he hits them right in the face with the sin problem that they're having in the church in the city of Corinth. And there's some immorality going on. There's sounds like a stepson sleeping or taking up with his father's wife. And it says wife like it's an ongoing relationship, like the son and the father are both whatever. But Paul addresses this and he says, man, you got to get rid of the sin. You got to kick him out of the church, and not to be mean, but kind of as an awakening, kind of as punishment to get him straight. And once he gets straight, I mean, you can see it. Paul's like, go ahead and bring him back in. But until then, you got to judge him on what he's doing on this behavior. Sin is like a cancer and it's got to be cut out. Paul talks about a little bit of leaven goes through the dough. Yeast, when you have this dough on its own will not rise, it'll just be flat. But if you put yeast in it and let it sit, the yeast works its way through the entire batch, and all of a sudden it just grows. And that's how you get, the slices of white bread or wheat bread that we eat sandwiches on. That rises from just a little bit of dough, and the yeast is what does that. But it's like sin is like that. One little bit of sin gets in, and it spreads throughout the whole body. And before you know it, the whole body is corrupted with sin. So sin's got to be cut out the minute you find it. The minute you recognize it in yourself, you've got to get rid of it. And then he goes into judging each other. And I love this part because we as Christians get this wrong most of the time. I mean, it's without doubt, every time I've had a Sunday school or anything, any kind of lesson that I've been involved in that has anything to do with judging, people are always confused. Do we judge? Do we not judge? Well, Paul lays it out pretty clearly here. We judge other Christians. Look at it this way, and this is not thought out, so if this is screwed up, forget it. But think of morality, from a scale of 1 to 100. If you're not a Christian and you don't abide by the Christian, the Ten Commandments or the Beatitudes, the teachings that Jesus gave us, and the teachings that we have in the Bible, if you're not a Christian and you don't believe in those things, then how can you be 100% moral? Only a person, and I say only, when we're judging people, we judge people based on what we know. And those are the things I just talked about. I can't judge a non-Christian based on Christian values because they're not a Christian. They haven't agreed to live that life, if that makes sense. So Christians only judge each other inside the faith, and not to be, well, I'm better than you because I blah, 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 blah. We judge each other and call each other out to keep each other accountable, to make sure that we stay on the straight and narrow path. Because if somebody wanders off, you got to judge them and bring them back to center. If somebody starts backsliding, you call them out on that sin and try and bring them back in line with the life they're called to live. We judge other Christians. We don't judge somebody outside the church. We love them, but we don't judge them. It doesn't mean we can't correct their behavior or point things out to them, but we don't judge them, and we only judge each other out of love. So it's It's a long, very good lesson, and something I think is maybe not absolute foundational like forgiveness is, like humility is, but when you're building the walls of your house, it's definitely a pillar that you need to stand up on top of your foundation. But judgment's very important. And he goes on and he says, why do you ask a non-Christian to judge you? They haven't agreed to live to the standards which you live to, but yet you're going to ask them to judge you. Paul says, don't do that. Find a wise man amongst the believers to judge if you have a problem with somebody else. But if you have a problem with somebody else, instead of looking for somebody to judge you, whether in the church or outside the church, Paul says in verse 7, actually then, it is already a defeat for you that you have lawsuits with one another. Why not rather suffer the wrong? Why not rather be defrauded? Now this sounds kind of crazy, like why would I want to be wronged or defrauded? But that's part of forgiveness. Proverbs 19:11, it's one of my favorite proverbs. It says, a man's wisdom gives him patience, and it is to his glory to overlook an offense. In other words, go around and don't be offended. If somebody says something nasty to you, don't just let it pass by. You don't even have to. Do not be offended. Can you go through the day without being offended? I challenge you. Let's call this the offensive challenge. Go a whole day without being offended by somebody. But on the other hand, this would be such a cool practice. Every time you do find yourself being offended, honestly, you don't have to share this with anybody, but honestly, I challenge you to write down, I caught myself being offended because so-and-so said this and I took it the wrong way. I found myself being offended on the way to work because this guy cut me off and this one, blah, blah, blah. I found myself getting offended. You'll be amazed at how many times in a single day you were offended. You allowed yourself to be offended. You didn't overlook the offense. You didn't forgive and move on. You let that offense sink in like the cancer. That one little bit gets in there and all of a sudden you got this root of bitterness and you're angry about everything and everybody's offending you. Do not be offended. Who cares? Don't let them sue you. Don't sue someone else. Hebrews 12:14 says this, pursue peace with all people and the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. Pursue peace. Pursue peace. Don't be offended. A little bit further down in Proverbs in 20 verse 3, it says, avoiding strife is an honor for a person, but a fool will quarrel. Avoiding strife is an honor of a person. Don't be offended. That's what Paul's getting at here. And that is, to me, that's the big takeaway from this whole read. And I'm running out of time. Paul goes on to talk about marriage. He gives his opinion about marriage. I have a different opinion than Paul does because Paul says, if you're not married, don't get married. But God says in the very beginning, go into all the world and multiply and make image bearers of me. God wants us to multiply and take over the earth. And you can't do that if you don't get married. Chapter 8, humility in your knowledge. Good read. All of it's a good read, obviously. Tomorrow we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapters 9 through 11. So read ahead and I'll see you here tomorrow. In the meantime, be safe.